We all know the saying, everything's bigger in Texas. Prior to 1866, the population boom of longhorn cattle in Texas certainly proved that true. There were as many as 5 million head of longhorn cattle roaming the green grasslands of South and West Texas. The Blue River Cattle Trail was a vital part of the legendary cattle drives from Texas to Nebraska. The large supply of longhorn cattle stood ready to meet the high demand of beef out east. There were two ways to transport cattle, by train and by trail. Cattlemen preferred trail drives to trains as the cost by railway was much more exorbitant. Additionally, if a herd proceeded at a leisurely pace on a trail that had good grazing, the cattle might weigh more at the end of the drive and fetch a higher price. The best herd size for travel was from 1,500 to 3,000 head of cattle, and cowboys or drovers were typically paid $100 or more per head. Initially, the cattlemen would walk the herd up the Shawnee Trail to the Missouri area as they relied on transport via barges along the Missouri and Mississippi rivers to take their cattle on east. Trail drives took anywhere from 3 to 6 months from Texas, with many slings and arrows of outrageous fortune awaiting the teams. The trail drives were tough, and tougher still was the outbreak of Spanish or Texas fever. This bovine malady was spread by ticks on the Texas Longhorns, who were immune to the disease, but caused the death of many local cattle as the herds passed northward in their wake. Local farmers and homesteaders who saw their cattle die from Texas fever would often retaliate against the trail drovers. Farmers made the Longhorns stampede or even shot at them and often went after the cowboys themselves. As a response to the tension between farmers and drovers and to protect local cattle, Missouri and Kansas enacted state quarantines that caused the cattlemen to move westward from the quarantine areas. Despite these highs and lows, the cattle industry was a lucrative business. All of that changed with the start of the Civil War, putting a pause on all interstate commerce and westward development until after the war. After the war was over, Texas stockmen were enthusiastic about their prospect to bring Yankee dollars home to help rebuild their poverty-stricken state. At the same time, beef was in great demand in the north as the war had depleted their livestock and western expansion resumed. As many as 260,000 longhorns were rounded up in 1866, and cattlemen made their way back towards Missouri via the Shawnee Trail and the river barges that awaited them. However, Missourians remembered the scourge of the Texas fever that the Longhorns brought and quickly turned back the approaching herds. Drovers listed westward and eventually established a new corridor through the center of Kansas along the Middle Shawnee Trail, which we know today as the Chisholm Trail. Unfortunately, the railroads had not yet developed through Kansas, so many of the 250,000 cattle were stranded on the Kansas prairies in 1866. In 1867, Joseph McCoy, the youngest member of the McCoy brothers' livestock shipping firm from Illinois, learned of the Texas cattlemen's plight and sought to establish a profitable shipping point farther west. He landed on Abilene, a very small, dead place consisting of about 12 log huts, according to McCoy's journal, where the railroad had already run through as far as Salina. Joseph purchased a tract of land there, where he immediately built stockyards, a hotel, offices, and other support facilities, creating a railhead. He convinced the governor of Kansas to not enforce quarantine law in the Abilene area and launched an advertising campaign throughout Kansas and Texas to bring herds up to the new railhead for the Kansas Pacific Railroad. 45,000 head were trailed north in 1867, which was a promising first year for Joseph McCoy. 3 months after Abilene shipped their first load of Texas Longhorns via the Kansas Pacific Railroad, Union Pacific decided to extend a spur line to the Little Blue River 100 miles west of Atchison, Kansas. They named the location Waterville and immediately built it up as a railhead for the Central Branch Railroad. In early 1868, both Abilene and Waterville anxiously awaited the spring drives. Even though Waterville was farther north, it had more abundant grazing land and lower freight rates, while Abilene was facing railcar shortages. Altogether, 75,000 head reached Kansas in 1868. If drovers saw the potential for better fortunes north of Abilene, they would cut northeast toward Waterville at the forks of the Little and Big Blue Rivers or continue northward. The herds would pass through Marysville, Kansas, into Nebraska and follow up the east side of the Big Blue River, passing by Beatrice, Crete, Milford, and Seward, and on up to either Shell Creek Station or Columbus, crossing the Platte River. Some continued north from there to Indian territories. There were no loading chutes or holding pens at either location in 1868, forcing drovers to turn their herds east in hopes of marketing them in Omaha or loading them on barges to cross the Missouri River. 1869 proved to be a banner year for Texas drovers. Between the railheads in Abilene and Waterville actively shipping cattle east and the growing market in Nebraska, as many as 350,000 head were delivered. While Abilene and Waterville were established, key players were working to bring the cattle industry north into Nebraska. The battle for cattle began heating up between Kansas and Nebraska. In Abilene, the Kansas Pacific Railroad was capitalizing on their success, but they were overplaying their hand. The railroad's rates rose to a high of $135 per car from Abilene to Chicago. Additionally, cowboys became increasingly dissatisfied with the railroad's uncaring attitude towards the loaded cattle, delays in switches and maneuvering, and unnecessary changing at junctions, which caused the cattle to arrive in Chicago in poor condition. In the 1869-1870 winter, Union Pacific officials became interested in offering services to the Texans somewhere along the Platte River line. At the same time, a group of Texas cattlemen banded together and asked Judge William N. Fant to represent them. When Kansas Pacific officials blew him off, Fant appealed to Union Pacific in Omaha. He proposed that if the railroad would provide satisfactory facilities, the Texans he represented might market as many as 100,000 head in Nebraska. Union Pacific worked with Judge Fant, and by February 1870, UP offered a final rate of $100 per car. Once word got out that Judge Fant and UP officials were searching for an ideal spot to compete with Abilene along the Platte River, a melee ensued from Omaha to Columbus, with each town jockeying for the coveted moniker of UP Railhead. Columbus had positioned themselves to be the ideal location, being an established community since 1856 with an outfitting post for wagon trains along the Mormon Trail and an impressive bridge across the Platte River that was under construction in 1870. Fremont also hoped to gain Fant's attention. Founded at the same time as Columbus, it became the seat of Dodge County in 1860 and believed that they were as good as any to become the cattle rail center. Between Columbus and Fremont, Shell Creek Station grew to become Schuyler in 1866. Only about a dozen families were scattered throughout the nearby countryside, and it had little incentive to offer the railroad except for its location at the end of the Blue River Cattle Trail. Regardless of the steep competition, Judge Fant and the Union Pacific officials chose Schuyler due to its ideal location. A rapid transformation began, building extensive stockyards, buildings, scales, and 3 loading chutes, anticipating the potential thousands of cattle arriving there. Judge Fant returned to his Texas compatriots and convinced them that the added miles to Schuyler from Abilene were worth the extra distance. Schuyler offered higher sale prices as contractors were eager to buy Texas cattle to supply Indian agencies, lower shipping costs, and a shorter, more direct route to Chicago by 150 miles. Pasture land in the Platte Valley was also much better than around Abilene. The wager that Judge Fant and Union Pacific officials placed on making Schuyler the bullhead had paid off, with 40 to 50,000 head of cattle sold in the summer of 1870 alone. The first herd was shipped on July 8, 1870, with 11 carloads of Texas beeves averaging 1,100 pounds per head. Each car could comfortably hold 18 to 20 head. It was estimated that 1 out of every 6 Longhorns that left Texas that year ended up in Nebraska. The 1871 market opened with high spirits. Various historians stated that over 600,000 head of cattle entered Kansas in 1871, the greatest number in Texas cattle trailing history. Unfortunately, a variety of factors caused the cattle market to go from boom to bust. Contract and sale prices had diminished as the eastern states were gaining back their own beef and cattle supply. The rate war ended between freight companies as the market value normalized. Trails closed or moved with the influx of homesteaders in eastern Kansas and Nebraska. This caused the drovers to create a western fork of the Blue River Cattle Trail, abandoning the path to Waterville by 1870. Farmers were increasingly hostile to drovers. The memory of Texas fever kept farmers on edge, and they would stampede every herd that passed their farms. Tragically, thousands of cattle died over winter. The Texas Longhorns were not used to the cold Midwestern environment. Additionally, prairie grasses soured and became weak in nutrients for the trailing herds. Storms caused many stampedes, causing cattle to lose weight and arrive in poor condition. In 1871, the Nebraska legislature passed a herd law stating that everyone had to restrain their animals or pay damages. The new law imposed fines on the trail boss, allowing unsavory ranchers and farmers to stampede or steal cattle with threats of hauling drovers into court to pay for real or supposed damage to crops and gardens. The rising distaste by the townspeople caused them to tire of the rough-riding trailmen and announced it no longer wanted cowboys. With the rise in population in eastern Nebraska and a more perilous trek now awaiting them on the Blue River Cattle Trail, cattlemen shifted westward again towards Kearney and Ogallala. By the end of 1872, the routes to Baxter Springs, Junction City, Abilene, and Schuyler were all but abandoned. The Blue River Cattle Trail ran from Abilene, Kansas to Schuyler, Nebraska. It was active primarily from 1868 to 1871. The trail ran along the Big Blue River to Ulysses, where the river turned west. Then the trail followed creeks and rivulets as it cut northeast across Butler County to the south of Schuyler, where it crossed the Platte River and into the stockyards. In 1870, a western branch was forged due to the expansion of homesteaders in Abilene and Waterville. It was the first trail to bring the Texas beef and cattle industry into central Nebraska. The Blue River Cattle Trail was an integral part of the post-Civil War reunification efforts between North and South, invigorating mutual commerce between the states. It is estimated that over 1.5 million cattle traversed the Blue River Cattle Trail from 1868 to 1872. Between 1866 and 1890, over 10 million cattle were driven north out of Texas on the cattle trails to the various towns that were the end of the tracks. The Blue River Cattle Trail stands as a testament to the pioneering spirit of the cowboys and drovers who forged the trails that laid the foundation for today's railroads and highways. Happy trails, y'all.